Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Absolute Knowing. The spirit of the revealed religion has not yet surmounted its consciousness as such, or what is the same, its actual self-consciousness is not the object of its consciousness, spirit itself as a whole. And the self-differentiated moments within it fall within the sphere of picture thinking and in the form of objectivity. The content of this picture thinking is absolute spirit. And all that now remains to be done is to supersede this mere form, or rather, since this belongs to consciousness as such, its truth must already have yielded itself in the shape of consciousness. This surmounting of the object of consciousness is not to be taken one-sidedly, to mean that the object showed itself as returning into the self, but is to be taken more specifically to mean not only that the object as such presented itself to the self as vanishing, but rather that it is the externalization of self-consciousness that posits the thinghood, or the object, and that this externalization has not merely a negative but a positive meaning, a meaning which is not only for us or in itself, but for self-consciousness itself. The negative of the object, or its self-supersession, has a positive meaning for self-consciousness. That is, self-consciousness knows the nothingness of the object on the one hand, because it externalizes its own self, for in this externalization it posits itself as object, or the object as itself, in virtue of the indivisible unity of being for self. On the other hand, this positing at the same time contains the other moment, namely that self-consciousness has equally superseded this externalization, and objectivity too, and taken it back into itself so that it is in communion with itself in its otherness as such. This is the movement of consciousness, and in that movement, consciousness is the totality of its moments. Equally, consciousness must have related itself to the object in accordance with the totality of the latter's determinations, and have thus grasped it from the standpoint of each of them. This totality of its determinations establishes the object as an implicitly spiritual being, and it does truly become a spiritual being for consciousness when each of its individual determinations is grasped as the determination of the self, or through the spiritual relationship to them that was just mentioned. Thus, the object is in part immediate being, or in general a thing, corresponding to immediate consciousness, in part anothering of itself, its relationship or being for another, and being for itself, that is, determinateness corresponding to perception, and in part essence, or in the form of a universal corresponding to the understanding. It is, as a totality, a syllogism, or the movement of the universal through determination to individuality, as also the reverse movement from individuality through superseded individuality, or through determination to the universal. It is therefore in accordance with these three determinations that consciousness must know the object as itself. However, this knowing of which we are speaking is not knowing as pure comprehension of the object, that is, in terms of the notion. Here, this knowing is to be indicated only in its process of coming to be, or in the moments of that aspect of it which belongs to consciousness as such. The moment of the notion proper of pure knowing in the form of shapes of consciousness. For this reason, the object does not yet appear in consciousness as such, as the spiritual essentiality we have just affirmed it to be, and the relationship of consciousness to it is not the consideration of it in this totality as such, nor in its pure form as notion, but it is from one side a shape of consciousness as such, and from the other side a number of such shapes which we bring together, in which the totality of the moments of the object and of the relation to consciousness to it can be indicated only as resolved into its moments. For this aspect of the apprehension of the object, that is, as it exists in the shape of consciousness, we have only to recall the earlier shapes of consciousness already encountered. Thus, in regard to the object so far as it is an immediacy, that is, as an indifferent being, we saw observing reason seeking and finding itself in this indifferent thing. That is, we saw it equally conscious of its action being external to it, as it was conscious of the object only as an immediate object, and we saw observing reason at its peak express its specific character in the infinite judgment that the being of the I is a thing, and moreover a sensuous immediate thing. When the I is called soul, it is true that it is also represented as a thing, but as something invisible, intangible, etc., and therefore in fact not as an immediate being, and not as what is meant by a thing. That judgment, taken just as it stands, is non-spiritual, or rather is the non-spiritual itself. In its notion, however, it is in fact the most richly spiritual, and this inner significance of what is not yet apparent is what is expressed in the two other moments to be considered. In search of the absolute. The thing is I. In point of fact, in this infinite judgment of thing, the thing is superseded in itself. It is nothing. It has met only in the relation, only through the I and its connection with it. This moment manifested itself for consciousness in pure insight and enlightenment. Things are simply useful and to be considered only from the standpoint of utility. The cultivated self-consciousness, which has traversed the world of self-alienated spirit, has through its self-alienation produced the thing as its own self. Therefore, it still retains its own self in it and knows that the thing lacks self-subsistence. That it is essentially only a being for another, or to give complete expression to the relationship, that is, to what alone constitutes the nature of the object. Here, the thing counts for it as something that exists on its own account. It declares sense certainty to be absolute truth, but this being for self is itself declared to be a moment that merely vanishes and passes over into its opposite, into a being that is at the disposal of another. However, at this stage, knowledge of the thing is still not complete. It must be known not only from the standpoint of the immediacy of being and of determinateness, but also as essence or inner being, as self. This occurs in moral self-consciousness. This is aware that its knowledge is a knowledge of what is absolutely essential. It knows that being is simply and solely pure willing and knowing. It is nothing else but this willing and knowing anything else as only unessential being, that is, not intrinsic being, only its empty husk. In the same measure that moral self-consciousness lets determinate being go free from the self, so too in its conception of the world it takes it back again into itself. Finally, as conscience, it is no longer this continual alternation of existence being placed in the self and vice versa. It knows that its existence as such is this pure certainty of itself. The objective element into which it puts itself forth when it acts is nothing other than the self's pure knowledge of itself. These are the moments of which the reconciliation of spirit with its own consciousness proper is composed. By themselves they are single and separate, and it is solely their spiritual unity that constitutes the power of this reconciliation. The last of these moments is, however, necessarily this unity itself, and, as is evident, it binds them all into itself. The spirit that in its existence is certain of itself has for the element of existence nothing else but this knowledge of itself. When it declares that what it does out of a conviction of duty, this utterance is the validating of its action. Action is the first implicit sundering of the simple unity of the notion and the return out of this dividedness. This first movement changes round into the second, since the element of recognition posits itself as simple knowledge of duty in antithesis to the distinction and dichotomy that lie in action as such, and so constitutes a stubborn actuality confronting action. But in forgiveness we saw how this obstinacy surrenders and renounces itself. Here, therefore, actuality as well as immediate existence has for self-consciousness no other significance than that of being a pure knowing, similarly as determinate existence or as relation. What is self-opposed is a knowing, partly of this purely individual self, partly a knowledge of as universal. In this is posited at the same time that the third moment, the universality or essence, counts only as a knowledge for each of the two sides that stand over against each other, and finally these latter equally resolve the empty antithesis still remaining, and are the knowledge of I equals I, this individual self, which is immediately a pure knowing or a universal. This reconciliation of consciousness with its self-consciousness thus shows itself as brought about from two sides. On one side in the religious spirit, and on the other side in consciousness itself as such. The difference between them is that in the former, this reconciliation is in the form of being in itself, or implicit being, and in the latter, in the explicit form of being for self. In our consideration of them, they at first fall apart. In the other, in which the shapes of consciousness came before us, consciousness reached the individual moments of those shapes and their unification long before every religion gave its object the shape of actual self-consciousness. The unification of the two sides has not yet been exhibited. It is this that closes the series of the shapes of spirit, for in it spirit attains to a knowledge of itself, not only as it is in itself, or as possessing an absolute content, nor only as it is for itself, that should say, as it is for itself, as a form devoid of content, or as the aspect of self-consciousness, but as it is both in essence and in actuality, or in and for itself.